Glad you liked it. Let me know if you need any changes or if you want another speech on a different topic. A nuclear war is not just another conflict, it is the ultimate catastrophe that humanity cannot afford. The devastation it brings is beyond imagination, affecting not only the warring nations but the entire planet. It is a war in which there are no winners, only unimaginable suffering and irreversible destruction. The first and most immediate consequence of a nuclear exchange is the loss of millions of lives within seconds. Entire cities, built over centuries, would be reduced to ashes in the blink of an eye. The heat from a nuclear explosion is so intense that human bodies would vaporize instantly, leaving behind nothing but shadows imprinted on the ground. Those who survived the initial blast would face an even worse fate: severe burns, radiation sickness, and a lifetime of suffering. Beyond the immediate destruction, the long-term effects would be even more horrifying. The detonation of multiple nuclear weapons would create massive firestorms, sending millions of tons of soot and debris into the atmosphere. This would block sunlight, plunging the world into what scientists call a nuclear winter. Temperatures would drop drastically, causing agricultural collapse. Crops would fail, livestock would perish, and food supplies would dwindle. Billions of people, even in countries far from the war zone, would face starvation. Radiation would contaminate the air, water, and soil, making vast areas of the planet uninhabitable for generations. Cancer rates would skyrocket. Birth defects would become common, and entire populations would suffer from genetic mutations. No amount of medical aid could cope with the sheer scale of human suffering. Hospitals would be overwhelmed, and the world's healthcare systems would collapse. The global economy would be shattered beyond repair. International trade would halt, financial markets would crash, and entire industries would be wiped out. Nations dependent on imports for food, medicine, and energy would struggle to survive. The global supply chain, already fragile in times of peace, would completely disintegrate. The modern world, built on economic interdependence, would crumble under the weight of chaos. Social order would break down. Lawlessness, desperation, and violence would spread as people fight for the last remaining resources. Governments would struggle to maintain control, and in many places, authority would simply cease to exist. The world would be thrown into anarchy, where only the strongest survive. And this is just the beginning. The long-term impact of a nuclear war would change the course of human history forever. The United Nations was established in the aftermath of the deadliest conflict in human history, World War II, with a singular purpose: to prevent future wars and maintain global peace. It was created as a beacon of hope, a platform where nations, regardless of their power or size, could come together to resolve conflicts through dialogue rather than bloodshed. The UN Charter, signed in 1945, set forth principles that promise to uphold justice, protect human rights, and promote international cooperation. Yet, despite these noble ideals, the world today stands on the edge of catastrophe. And the question must be asked: has the United Nations truly fulfilled its role? At the heart of the UN's mission is the Security Council, the body responsible for maintaining peace and security. But instead of being a force for justice, it has often become a stage for power politics. The very structure of the Security Council, with its 5 permanent members holding veto power, has made it a tool for the powerful rather than a protector of the weak. Decisions that should be based on principles of justice are instead shaped by national interests. This has led to selective interventions, double standards, and an inability to take decisive action in moments of crisis. Time and again, the world has witnessed gross violations of human rights, illegal occupations, and brutal wars, yet the UN has remained paralyzed. Resolutions are passed but not implemented. Condemnations are issued but carry no consequences. Sanctions are applied selectively, often punishing the weak while allowing the strong to act with impunity. The very foundation of international law is being eroded before our eyes. As certain nations manipulate the system to serve their own agenda, the failure of the United Nations is not just about inaction. It is about the loss of credibility. If institutions meant to uphold justice turn a blind eye to oppression, then what hope remains for the people who suffer? When the voices of the powerless are drowned out by geopolitical interests, what faith can the world have in this organization? The promise of the UN was to be an impartial force for peace. Yet today, its silence in the face of injustice has made it complicit in global instability. The consequences of this failure are dire. When institutions meant to prevent war become ineffective, the world moves closer to conflict. The oppressed, abandoned by the very system meant to protect them, are left with no choice but to fight for their survival. History has shown that when peaceful avenues are blocked, desperation leads to actions that cannot be reversed. The lack of justice fuels resentment, and resentment fuels wars. This is the cycle the world has seen for decades, and unless the UN fulfills its true purpose, this cycle will never end. The role of the United Nations must go beyond issuing statements and passing resolutions. It must act. If global peace is truly the objective, then there can be no room for selective morality. The powerful must be held accountable, just as the weak are. If the UN does not stand for justice, then what does it stand for? If it cannot stop wars, then why does it exist? If it continues on this path of silence and inaction, then the world must ask itself, how long can we afford to rely on an institution that has lost its way? The world today stands at a crossroads, haunted by unresolved conflicts that continue to fester like open wounds. These conflicts, some stretching back decades, have become breeding grounds for resentment, radicalization, and instability. When injustice is ignored and grievances are left unaddressed, tensions do not simply disappear, they escalate. The international community's failure to resolve long-standing disputes has created an environment where war is always one miscalculation away. The world today is in desperate need of true leadership. Leadership that is not driven by self-interest, political gains, or economic ambitions, but by a genuine commitment to justice, peace, and the well-being of humanity. Throughout history, nations have risen and fallen based on the strength of their leaders. The choices made by those in power determine the fate of millions. Yet, as we stand on the brink of unprecedented global crises, the world finds itself lacking the kind of leadership that is willing to stand for what is right, even when it is difficult. True leadership is not about possessing military power or economic dominance. It is not about issuing threats or enforcing policies through coercion. Leadership in its truest form is the ability to inspire, to unite, and to steer the world toward a future that is safe, just, and prosperous for all. But what do we see today? Instead of leaders who bring nations together, we see those who deepen divisions. Instead of visionaries who work toward peace, we see short-sighted politicians who fuel conflicts. Instead of statesmen who seek justice, we see individuals who manipulate the system for their own interests. The absence of true global leadership is evident in the way international crises are handled. Wars are waged under the pretense of security while diplomatic solutions are sidelined. Economic policies are designed to benefit a few while leaving billions in poverty. International institutions meant to uphold peace are used as tools of influence by powerful nations. Injustice is ignored when it does not serve political agendas, and voices of the oppressed are silenced. This is not leadership, this is failure. A true leader is not afraid to speak the truth, even when it is inconvenient. A true leader does not stand with the powerful at the expense of the weak. A true leader does not bow to pressure, but stands firm for principles that serve humanity. Where are these leaders today? Where is the courage to challenge injustice? Where is the vision to create a world where conflicts are resolved through dialogue rather than war? The world is waiting, but those who should lead remain silent. The consequences of this leadership vacuum are devastating. Without strong and just leadership, conflicts continue to escalate. Nations act recklessly because they know there is no one to hold them accountable. Economic inequalities widen, fueling resentment and instability. The climate crisis worsens because immediate profits are prioritized over long-term survival. The most vulnerable suffer the most, while those in power look the other way. And as these problems grow, the world moves closer to an irreversible disaster. The question is no longer whether we need leadership, it is whether the world will find it before it is too late. Leadership is not just a position, it is a responsibility. And in times of crisis, failing to lead is just as dangerous as leading in the wrong direction. The world cannot afford empty promises, nor can it survive on statements that are never followed by action. The time for leadership is now. The time for decisive action is now. The time to rise above personal interests and work for the collective future of humanity is now. But if this leadership does not emerge, if those in power continue to hesitate, if the world continues to drift without direction, then the consequences will be written in history, not as a failure of individuals, but as the downfall of an entire civilization. The world is at a tipping point, and the decisions made today will determine the fate of generations to come. History has proven that unresolved conflicts are never truly frozen. They simmer beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. Generations are born into cycles of suffering, knowing nothing but occupation, oppression, and violence. Children grow up seeing their lands taken, their rights denied, and their voices silenced. What kind of future can be built on such foundations? When people are denied justice for too long, they begin to believe that peace is impossible. And when peace is no longer seen as an option, desperation takes its place. Around the world, we see regions trapped in endless disputes where ceasefires offer only temporary relief before violence resumes. Why? Because ceasefires are not solutions. They are mere pauses in a conflict that remains unresolved at its core. True peace can only come when the root causes of these conflicts are addressed. Yet time and again, the world chooses to look away, treating symptoms instead of curing the disease. The powerful intervene when it suits their interests and turn their backs when it does not. This selective approach to justice is what keeps the fires of conflict burning. The failure to resolve these disputes has consequences that reach far beyond their borders. In today's interconnected world, no conflict remains isolated. The suffering of one people inevitably affects another. Refugee crises spill into neighboring countries, burdening economies and straining social fabrics. Extremist ideologies find fertile ground in communities that feel abandoned by the world. When people lose hope in diplomacy, they turn to any means necessary to fight for their survival. It is a vicious cycle, one that history has repeated time and again. The hypocrisy of global powers further fuels these tensions. One nation's struggle for freedom is labeled terrorism, while another's aggression is justified under the pretense of security. This double standard does not go unnoticed. It deepens divisions, erodes trust in international institutions, and makes diplomatic resolutions even harder to achieve. How can there be peace when the very system that claims to uphold justice is seen as biased? How can disputes be resolved when the oppressed are denied a fair hearing? The world cannot afford to ignore these unresolved conflicts any longer. Every moment of inaction brings us closer to the breaking point. The longer these issues are left to fester, the greater the risk that one spark will ignite a fire that engulfs entire regions. And when that fire starts, it will not be contained. It will spread, consuming everything in its path.